Seo catches his young housemaid secretly taking leftover food to a little boy. Driven by curiosity, he disguises himself and follows the boy, only to discover he is her younger brother, living with their ailing mother in a crumbling house. The next morning when he calls her into his study, something happens that changes her life forever. Before we begin, a question for you. What time are you listening and where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. The night air was thick with the cool, damp scent of an early autumn rain. It wasn't a downpour but a fine mist that settled on everything. The drizzle clung to the polished hood of the black Mercedes as it glided quietly into the private driveway, its headlights carving long beams through the gold-tinted fog. The street was silent except for the low hum of distant traffic and the occasional soft hiss of tires on wet asphalt. Ornate street lamps cast warm halos onto the brick pavement, each circle of light reflecting off the slick stones like ripples of molten amber. Inside the car, Richard Holloway gripped the steering wheel with the easy confidence of a man who had made this journey countless times. But tonight he was later than usual, the weight of an extended board meeting still heavy on his shoulders. At 53, with silver at his temples and a reputation built on decisive action, Richard was used to controlling every variable in his world. Yet as he eased the car to a stop and the engine fell silent, something about the stillness felt different. He stepped out, the drizzle a gentle tapping on his tailored overcoat. The wrought iron gates loomed ahead, their intricate curves black against the golden light. As the automatic latch clicked open, Richard's gaze was drawn to the side path, a place he rarely noticed. There just beyond the hedge stood Maya. She was only 23, the youngest of his household staff. Normally cheerful with a quiet grace, she now looked like a shadow trying to disappear. Her dark hair, damp from the mist, clung in soft waves around her face. She held a plain paper bag tight against her chest, glancing left and right as if afraid of being caught. Richard slowed his steps, allowing the rhythm of his shoes on the wet stone to blend with the sound of the rain. He watched as Maya moved toward the back gate, the one leading to the service alley. From the darkness emerged a figure. A boy no older than 12, so thin his jacket hung from his shoulders like it belonged to someone twice his size. The fabric was worn, the cuffs frayed, and his sneakers were caked with dried mud, their laces knotted in mismatched lengths. Maya knelt slightly so their eyes could meet, her voice barely audible over the patter of the drizzle. Richard couldn't make out the words, but he saw the faint curve of her lips in a gentle, almost sisterly smile, though it was shadowed by worry or perhaps guilt. She pulled the bag open just enough for him to see inside. The boy's eyes lit up for a brief, fleeting moment. They spoke softly, the boy's hands clutching the bag as if it were a priceless treasure. As quickly as it began, the exchange ended. Maya gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping back. The boy turned and vanished into the narrow darkness of the alley without a backward glance. Richard stood for a moment, the scene settling in his mind like a drop of ink spreading through water. He continued inside, the warmth of the marble foyer doing little to cut through the chill that had taken root in his chest. Habitually, he climbed the grand staircase to his private quarters. The house was utterly still, the kind of silence that comes only after every servant has retired. Yet his thoughts kept circling back to what he had just seen. The paper bag, the boy's luminous eyes, the way Maya's shoulders had dropped in relief when the food was finally out of her hands. He shrugged off his coat and crossed to his desk, where the sleek monitor for the home security system rested. A part of him claimed it was just curiosity. Another part, the one honed by decades of business negotiations, told him there was more to this than met the eye. Richard keyed in the access code and pulled up the camera feeds. The soft blue glow of the screen painted his face as he rewound the footage from the rear gate. He watched the grainy image of tonight's exchange, then kept scrolling back through previous nights. What he found made his pulse quicken. The same scene, almost identical, played out again and again. Maya, the bag, the boy. Night after night, always at the same hour, always at the same gate. The only variation was their clothes, sometimes dry, sometimes damp from the rain. But the ritual never changed. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. 100 questions flooded his mind at once. Who was the boy? Why had Maya never mentioned him? And why the secrecy, slipping food from a house where nothing was ever in short supply? The quiet hum of the monitor was the only sound in the room now, but Richard's mind was in turmoil. Somewhere within this nightly ritual was a truth he had not been invited to know, and that fact alone unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Tonight, curiosity had taken hold. Tomorrow he knew it would demand answers. The following night, the air felt sharper, the cold sliding down the narrow alley behind the mansion like a blade. The streetlights from the main road didn't reach here. Only a faint wash of amber spilled from the rear service door, casting long, uneasy shadows on the cracked pavement. Richard stood in the darkness near the corner, leaning slightly against the damp brick wall. Gone was his crisp overcoat and polished shoes. Tonight he was draped in a tattered army green jacket, its elbows frayed and darkened with grime. A tangled mass of fake whiskers clung to his jaw, the adhesive itching against his skin. His trousers hung loose, the fabric stiff with age, and a mismatched pair of gloves covered his hands. He had studied his transformation in the mirror earlier and found it convincing enough to vanish into the night as nothing more than a man down on his luck. The wind tunneled between the buildings, carrying the metallic scent of rain-soaked concrete. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then fell silent. He kept his gaze fixed on the small rear gate, the same one from the security footage. The seconds stretched on, his breath rising in pale wisps. Every faint sound sharpened his senses. The rattle of a loose shutter, the distant hum of an idling truck, the whisper of leaves brushing against the fence. Then, just as he began to wonder if she would come, Maya appeared. Her figure emerged from the glow of the service light, her dark hair pulled back into a loose bun, a thick cardigan wrapped around her narrow shoulders. She glanced behind her once, a quick, deliberate motion before stepping through the gate. In her hands was another plain paper bag, its bottom sagging slightly with its contents. From the shadows, Richard's heart gave a single hard thump. He pressed his shoulder deeper into the wall, keeping his head low. Moments later, the boy appeared, darting out from the mouth of the alley. His breath came fast, his hands jammed into the pockets of his thin jacket as if to keep them warm. They met halfway between the gate and the alley's end, just as they had the night before. Maya bent slightly, speaking to him in a voice too low for Richard to hear. The boy nodded quickly, his gaze darting toward the street beyond. She reached into the bag, shifting items to make it easier for him to hold, then placed it gently into his arms. His small fingers tightened instantly, knuckles pale against the brown paper. Richard stepped forward. Not too close, not too fast, but enough to be noticed. The crunch of his shoes on the grit drew their attention at once. Maya's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing as she took in his ragged frame. The boy stiffened, pulling the bag closer to his chest like a shield. "Evening," Richard said, pitching his voice low and rough, the way he imagined a man used to begging might sound. "I don't mean to intrude, but—" he nodded toward the bag. "Could you spare a little for someone who hasn't eaten in a while?" For a heartbeat she didn't move. Then without hesitation Maya reached in and pulled out a small wrapped sandwich, placing it gently into his outstretched hand. Her eyes softened, but her expression held no pity, only quiet resolve. "Here," she said simply. "Eat while it's still warm." The boy shifted uneasily, his gaze flicking between Maya and the stranger. Richard let his fingers close around the sandwich, feeling its slight warmth seep into his cold skin. "Thank you," he murmured, studying her face, the calm in her eyes despite the situation. "Is he your brother?" The question slipped out, more probing than he'd intended. The boy's head lifted sharply, and for an instant, Richard saw a flash of fear or perhaps defiance. "Yes," Maya answered quietly, her tone final, leaving no room for further questions. Richard opened his mouth to press further, but the boy was already moving. Without a word, he turned and sprinted down the alley, the paper bag thumping softly against his side. Maya called after him once, her voice a mix of warning and care, but he didn't stop. His footsteps faded quickly into the maze of narrow streets. Richard stood there, the sandwich in his hand growing cooler by the second. The wind picked up again, tugging at the hem of his jacket. Maya's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, as if weighing whether to say something more, then she simply turned back toward the gate. She slipped inside without another word, the lock clicking softly behind her. Alone now, Richard looked toward the alley where the boy had vanished, his mind churning with questions. The secrecy hung heavy in the air, more tangible than the cold, and he found himself no closer to understanding why this ritual was hidden from him, only more certain that it was. The following evening the sky hung low and heavy, the last threads of daylight bleeding into the horizon as the sun surrendered to night. A faint haze clung to the streets, curling in the corners of narrow alleys like smoke reluctant to leave. Richard stood across from the alley entrance where he had seen the boy disappear the night before. He was dressed again in the same tattered jacket, his beard roughened with a fresh layer of grime. The cold bit through the thin fabric, but he hardly noticed. His eyes were fixed on the small figure that emerged from the shadows. There he was, the boy walking with the hurried steps of someone who knew the way home by heart. Richard let him get a small lead before following. The soles of his worn shoes scraped quietly over the uneven pavement, every sound amplified in the silence between the walls. The alley narrowed, then bent sharply, revealing a tangle of back streets that twisted away from the orderly symmetry of the wealthy neighborhoods. Street lamps here were sparse, some cracked, others dead entirely, leaving long pools of darkness that swallowed sound. The air smelled faintly of rust and damp wood. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried briefly before the sound was smothered by a tired voice. The boy moved quickly, weaving through a labyrinth of passageways. His small shoulders were hunched against the evening chill. Richard kept his distance, careful to remain a shadow among shadows. The world here felt closer, heavier. Walls pressed in. Roofs leaned toward each other as though conspiring to keep out the light. There was no marble here, no polished brass or manicured hedges. Instead, doors were patched with plywood, windows covered in thin blankets that barely held back the cold. After several turns, the boy slowed. Ahead stood a small weather-beaten house crouched at the end of a narrow lane. Its siding was warped, paint long surrendered to peeling gray. The front steps sagged, their wood splintered and soft from years of rain. A single window cast a faint, flickering glow from inside. The boy glanced behind him once, but Richard had already melted into the darkness beside a leaning fence. The boy pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. Richard inched closer, careful not to let the loose boards underfoot betray him. Through the crack of the door and a broken slat in the wall, he could see the interior. A single room, cramped and dimly lit by a lamp whose shade leaned precariously to one side. The air inside looked cold despite the light, the kind of cold that seeps in when there's no proper heat to push it back. Against the far wall stood a narrow bed. On it lay a woman, her skin a shade paler than it should have been, her breath shallow and uneven. Her hair, streaked with gray, framed a face lined not just by age but by hardship. She turned her head slightly toward the sound of the boy's footsteps, her lips pulling into the faintest smile. He set the paper bag gently on a rickety table beside her and began unpacking the contents. Pieces of bread, a container of stew, a handful of apples that still held a sheen of refrigerator chill. Richard watched as the boy moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of routine. He fetched a cup from a shelf and filled it with water from a plastic jug, then held it carefully to the woman's lips. She sipped, her hand trembling slightly as it rested on his wrist. There was no chatter, no small talk. Their silence was not empty. It was filled with an understanding born of necessity. The room was sparse. A single chair sat near the bed, its cushion torn open to reveal yellowed stuffing. A stack of folded clothes served as a makeshift pillow on the floor next to a thin blanket. There was no smell of fresh cooking here, only the faint scent of damp fabric and the tang of the food Maya had sent home. Richard's gaze lingered on the boy's face as he handed his mother a small piece of bread, his eyes fixed on her as though willing her to take one more bite. In those eyes Richard saw more than fatigue. He saw the kind of guarded hope that came from living one day at a time. The woman murmured something, her voice so soft it barely reached the boy's ears. He smiled faintly in response, brushing a stray hair from her forehead with the back of his hand. For a moment the lines of worry in his young face eased. Then he turned toward the table, dividing the rest of the food into small portions, as if making it last was second nature to him. Richard felt a weight settle in his chest, heavier than the damp air. The image of his own kitchen flashed in his mind, gleaming countertops, stocked refrigerators, untouched platters of food discarded after dinner parties. The contrast was so stark it almost hurt to hold in his thoughts. He shifted slightly, the cold from the fence pressing into his back, and realized his hands had clenched into fists inside his gloves. He hadn't expected this. He had thought perhaps the boy lived with friends or in some shelter, not here in a house that seemed to bend under the weight of its own decay. He hadn't expected to see the quiet dignity with which they navigated their hardship, or the fierce tenderness in the way the boy cared for his mother. The minutes stretched on. The boy sat in the chair, his elbows resting on his knees, watching over her as she drifted into a restless sleep. Her breathing was uneven, but when her hand slid off the blanket, he reached over quickly to tuck it back in. Richard's breath fogged in the air as he stepped back from the wall. The scene behind it burned into his memory. There was nothing here of malice or deceit, only necessity. Only love wrapped in secrecy because perhaps pride or fear made it so. Yet the secrecy gnawed at him, raising questions about how long they had lived like this, and how many times Maya had quietly filled that paper bag, knowing it might be the difference between her family eating or going hungry. As he turned to leave, the narrow street seemed even darker than before, the cold sharper, the space between the mansion on the hill and this little house stretching into something immeasurable. He walked away slowly, his footsteps echoing in the stillness, carrying with him not just the image of poverty, but the unshakable sense that he had stepped into a world he had never truly seen, one that existed parallel to his own, separated by nothing more than the width of a city, yet by every measure of life, a world apart. The night had deepened into a stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. The narrow street lay deserted, the shadows settling heavy against the cracked walls. Overhead, the moon had climbed high enough to angle a pale beam through the single uncurtained window of the small house. That light spilled across the worn floorboards and over the bed where the woman lay, her shallow breaths rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. Richard stood just beyond the weathered door frame, his back against the warped siding, leaning close enough to see through the thin gap where the door failed to meet the jamb. Inside, the boy sat in the same chair as before, his elbows on his knees, chin resting in his small hands. His gaze never left his mother, the kind of gaze that carried both worry and a watchfulness beyond his years. The paper bag from earlier was gone, the contents already portioned out and tucked away, though Richard knew there couldn't have been much to save. The air inside was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the house settling and the whisper of the wind sneaking through the window frame. Richard's eyes shifted, catching the faint glint of a family photograph balanced on the edge of a shelf. Even from where he stood, he recognized Maya's open, warm smile, but also saw something in her eyes that he had missed before. He thought back to the mornings when she greeted him at the kitchen door, her voice light, and her hands already busy with the day's work. She had smiled then too, but now he could see the truth hiding behind it. A quiet heaviness and unspoken urgency she carried alone. He felt a tightness in his chest as the moments aligned in his mind like links in a chain. Every polite nod, every time she refused to take leftovers for herself, every quick glance at the clock before slipping away for the evening, it was all part of the same unbroken line leading here. She had been feeding her family from the scraps of his abundance, walking the thin edge between compassion and risk. If anyone in his world had noticed or complained, she could have lost the only income holding this fragile home together. The thought made him draw a slow, measured breath. In his world, problems were challenges to be solved, negotiations to win, markets to influence, deals to close. But this wasn't a boardroom problem. This was the kind of truth that stayed with you, the kind that rewrote the way you looked at people, even those you thought you knew. The boy reached forward, adjusting the blanket over his mother's shoulders. The motion was small, almost careful enough to be missed, but it hit Richard harder than any grand gesture could have. There was no complaint in the boy's face, no sign of resentment, only a kind of steady, unyielding care that made the edges of Richard's own certainty feel softer, less defined. He stepped back from the door, the boards under his feet groaning in quiet protest. The night air wrapped cold around him as he moved away from the house, each step deliberate, slow. He didn't want them to know he had been there. This wasn't a moment to be interrupted, and it wasn't his place to take it from them. At the corner of the lane, he paused and glanced back. The window still glowed faintly, the thin slice of moonlight crossing the room like a fragile bridge between the inside and the outside. He thought about the unspoken rules of the world he lived in, where wealth was meant to insulate and separate. Yet here he was, feeling the sharp pull of something that had nothing to do with business or propriety. The injustice of it pressed at him. The distance between his reality and theirs, the sheer imbalance that allowed one house to waste what another needed to survive. He could feel a stir of resolve beneath the weight of his thoughts, though it came tangled with a strange helplessness. There was no quick fix for this, No simple act that could erase the years that had led to this moment. He turned away fully now, the sound of his own footsteps the only noise in the sleeping street. Above him, the moon sailed on, indifferent to the quiet dramas unfolding below. Richard's mind was restless, but somewhere beneath the unease, a faint warmth had begun to grow. A recognition that perhaps the measure of a man wasn't only in what he built, but in how he chose to see, and what he chose to do once he had seen. Morning broke clear and bright, the city's usual haze swept aside by a crisp autumn sun. Light poured through the wide glass windows of Richard's corner office, spilling across the polished mahogany desk and glinting off the brass trim of his nameplate. He sat in his high-backed leather chair, the weight of the previous night still heavy in his thoughts. His tie lay loose against his collar, the top button undone, as though even the formality of his usual armor felt unnecessary this morning. The city below moved in orderly patterns, cars filing neatly along the avenues, pedestrians crossing in measured streams. But inside the office time seemed to slow. On the desk before him sat a freshly printed employment contract, the ink still smelling faintly of toner. Beside it lay a crisp white envelope holding a check, the numbers written in steady, deliberate strokes. Another folder lay open containing the paperwork for a private medical assistance plan, and next to that, a letter to the principal of a small local school. Arrangements for a scholarship that would bear no signature, no traceable generosity. He had spent the early hours putting each detail into place, his pen moving with the same precision he brought to business, but for an entirely different purpose. He thought of Maya's steady hands, the way she had placed food into her brother's arms without hesitation. He thought of the boy's careful watch over his mother, of the quiet resilience inside that small, dimly lit room. And with each image came the simple truth that he could change the course of their days, not by charity wrapped in spectacle, but by giving them the means to stand on steadier ground. Richard leaned back for a moment, letting the sunlight warm his face. The decision felt right, solid, like the final move in a long and careful game. There was no need for her to know how much he had seen or how deeply it had stirred him. The gift was not for gratitude but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had acted. Later that day, Maya was called into the small administrative office off the main hall of the mansion. She entered cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her, uncertain why she had been summoned. The house manager handed her a sealed envelope, her expression unreadable. Maya thanked her softly before stepping outside to open it. The sunlight caught the edge of the paper as she unfolded it. At first, her brow furrowed in confusion, then her breath caught. Her eyes moved over the words. A salary increase well beyond anything she had imagined, a comprehensive medical plan that would begin immediately, and a brief note that simply read, "For your continued dedication and the value you bring, both seen and unseen." Tucked behind the letter was the check, enough to erase the debts she had quietly carried for years. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her vision blurring as the weight of relief flooded her. Her first thought was of her mother, the medications they could now afford, the warmth they could bring into their home before winter tightened its grip. Then she thought of her brother, the school books he had wanted, the doors that could open for him now. She felt the sharp edge of gratitude, but also something steadier, a hope firm and unexpected, rooting itself deep within her. When she stepped back into the main corridor, Richard was there, leaning casually against the door frame of his office. He wasn't in his chair, wasn't behind the desk that usually separated him from the rest of the world. Their eyes met. He didn't speak and neither did she. He simply offered a small, genuine smile, his gaze steady, his presence quiet but certain. Maya nodded once, her throat too tight for words, and in that moment the understanding passed between them without a syllable spoken. She turned to leave, her steps lighter than when she had come in, the envelope held close against her chest. Richard watched her go, the corners of his mouth still curved in that faint, unassuming smile. He returned to his office, the city stretching out before him, its noise and ambition moving on as always. But somewhere in that expanse a small house would soon be warmer. A woman's breath would come easier, and a boy's future would carry more light than shadow. Winter came early that year, but the little house at the end of the narrow lane no longer felt like a place bracing against the cold. A new coat of paint brightened its weathered walls, and the front steps were repaired so they no longer groaned underfoot. Inside, the air carried the comforting scent of simmering soup, the kind that lingered in the corners and made the whole space feel alive. Maya's mother rested in a proper bed now, her breathing steadier, her cheeks carrying back some of the color that illness had taken. The boy sat at the table, his school books spread out before him, the clean pages marked with fresh ink from pencils that no longer needed to be borrowed. Maya moved between the stove and the table with a quiet joy, her laughter breaking through the small room like sunlight through open curtains. There was no trace of the secrecy and strain that had once marked their nights. In its place was a steadiness, a rhythm of life shaped by possibility. And though they never spoke of where the turning point began, each of them carried an unspoken understanding that somewhere beyond their walls, someone had chosen to see them, and in doing so had changed everything. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.